The judge's gavel came down so hard it cracked the wooden block clean in two. "Nora Hart," said Judge Aldous Crane, his voice like gravel dragged across sheet iron, "you are hereby declared a menace to commerce, a disruption to lawful settlement, and a danger to the civic order of not one but two territories." He leaned forward over his bench, his white whiskers trembling with barely contained fury. "New Mexico and Arizona both want you gone. I am inclined to give them what they want." The courtroom in Santa Fe was packed. Men in dusty coats pressed together in the gallery, some leaning out over the railings to catch a better look at the woman standing in the center of the room with her hands bound at the wrist, and her chin lifted so high it could have cut glass. She was 26 years old, black-haired, brown-eyed, with grease on her fingers that the holding cell's wash basin had failed to remove, and a bruise along her left jaw from where the territorial marshal's deputy had decided his hands were more persuasive than his words. She was not afraid. She had never once been afraid in a courtroom, and she had stood in 3 of them now. "Judge Crane," she said, her voice completely level, completely clear, carrying to every corner of the packed gallery without a single tremor. "Before you render that verdict, I would like the record to reflect that the Beaumont Mining Company illegally diverted the Culebra River Channel in 1883, using an unpermitted dam structure. That said diversion destroyed 11 farms belonging to families who had held their land grants since before New Mexico was even a territory. And that every single action I took was in direct response to a crime that your court has refused to prosecute for the better part of 2 years." A murmur moved through the gallery like wind through dry grass. The judge's face went the color of an old brick. "The matter before this court is not the Beaumont Mining Company," he said. "It should be," Nora replied. The murmur became a low rumble. 3 men in expensive suits in the front row exchanged glances, and the one in the center gave the barest nod toward the bailiff. Nora saw it. She had been watching for exactly that nod for the last 30 minutes. "Judge Crane," she said, a little faster now, her bound hands gripping each other in front of her, "I have documented every engineering survey the Beaumont Company submitted to this court. Everyone is fraudulent. The measurements of the river bed alone are wrong by 40 feet. I can prove it with my own survey data, gathered over 7 months, using a Gurley Transit theodolite, a precision-level rod, and trigonometric calculations that any competent engineer in this territory can verify. The dam is illegal. The diversion is illegal. The evictions that followed are illegal. And the men sitting in your front row paid someone to make sure this case never reached a jury." Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that sits in a room like a loaded weapon, pointed in every direction at once. And that was the moment. That was the moment everything broke open and Nora Hart stopped being a woman with a problem and became something the judge, the lawyers, the mining company, and the entire gallery could not simply manage or contain. That was the moment she became a force. But it had not started here, in Santa Fe, with a cracked gavel and a bruised jaw. It had started 6 months earlier, on a long road through the high desert of New Mexico, where a woman with a theodolite strapped to a mule and a leather survey notebook tucked under her arm had pulled her horse to a stop at the gate of the quietest, most deliberately unnoticed ranch in 200 miles. The sign above the gate read, "Malone," nothing else. Just the one word, burned into pine, simple and permanent. Nora had been looking for water, not just any water. She had been following the original survey lines of the Culebra River, tracing where it had run before the Beaumont Dam had redirected it, and she had calculated that somewhere behind this particular stretch of red rock fence line, there was a natural spring that predated the dam by several thousand years. If she could document it, tie it to the original watershed map, she could prove that Beaumont's diversion had not simply rerouted water. It had stolen it. She dismounted her horse, a dark bay mare named Consequence, tied her to the post, and unlatched the gate herself. A voice stopped her before she had taken 3 steps inside. "Gates latched for a reason." She turned. He was standing about 20 yards away near a water trough, one boot up on the edge of it, a piece of fence wire in one hand and pliers in the other. He was tall, built the way the land itself was built, with something permanent and unrushed about his proportions. Dark hair under a battered, wide-brimmed hat, a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. Eyes that were the particular dark brown of good timber left out in the weather, and they were watching her with an expression that was not angry, exactly, but was very much alert. He was probably 30, maybe 32. Old enough to be serious, young enough to have not yet given up on things. Monroe Malone, she asked. Depends on who's asking. Nora Hart. She crossed the remaining distance to him with the same unhurried confidence she brought to everything. I'm a surveyor. I need to access the spring on the eastern edge of your property. I believe it sits approximately 400 yards past your main fence line, near the base of the red sandstone formation. She pulled her notebook from under her arm and opened it to a precise, hand-drawn topographical sketch. I've marked it here based on geological survey data from 1873 and the original territorial water registry. I won't damage anything. I need 3 hours and permission. Monroe Malone looked at her. Then he looked at the notebook. Then he looked at the theodolite strapped to the side of her mule, which was considerably more sophisticated equipment than most people brought through his gate. You drew that yourself? He asked, nodding at the sketch. Yes. That's good work. She had not been expecting that. Most men either dismissed her outright, which she was prepared for, or they were so aggressively impressed that the impression itself became an obstacle. Monroe Malone said it the way he might have said it about a well-laid fence line or a properly balanced saddle. Not patronizing, not performing. Just honest assessment from a man who recognized quality when he saw it. Thank you, she said, and meant it. What do you need the spring for? She told him. Not the shortened version she gave to officials who had already decided not to listen, but the full version. The Beaumont Dam, the stolen water, the 11 families, the fraudulent surveys, the 2 years of silence from the courts. Monroe Malone listened without interrupting, which was already rarer than it should have been. He set down the fence wire and the pliers and gave her his complete attention. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be thoughtful but not long enough to be dismissive. Beaumont's got people at the courthouse, he said finally. I know. You've been out there 6 months alone doing this. 7 now. He looked at her for another long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not quite name, something that was not pity and was not suspicion. It might have been recognition. The way you look at something in the landscape that you have been waiting to see for a long time without knowing you were waiting. The spring is yours to document, he said. Take what time you need. She had expected to be in and out in 3 hours. She stayed 7. The spring was exactly where she had predicted it would be. More importantly, it was fed by an underground aquifer that she could prove, through careful measurement of its flow rate and mineral composition, was hydrologically connected to the original Culebra River watershed. It was the link in the chain she had been missing. The physical, documentable proof that the river's original course and the water rights attached to it legally preceded and superseded anything Beaumont had built. She was on her knees in the red mud beside the spring, water soaking through her trousers, conducting her final measurements by the last of the evening light when she heard footsteps behind her. Monroe. He had brought 2 tin cups and a pot of coffee. How's it going? He asked, settling himself onto a flat rock nearby with the particular ease of a man who had spent his entire life learning how to be still. She looked up. Her hands were muddy, her hair had come half undone from its braid, and she had a smear of dark red sandstone dust across her cheek that she was completely unaware of. Better than expected, she said. This spring is the key. If I can connect this flow data to the 1873 survey documents, I can demonstrate that Beaumont effectively stole a natural watercourse that the downstream farms had a legal prior claim to. She paused. Sorry, you probably didn't need the full explanation. I followed it, he said mildly, and held out one of the cups. She took it. The coffee was strong and honest, the kind made by someone who understood that a good cup of coffee was a kindness worth doing right. "You know," she said, wrapping both hands around the cup and sitting back on her heels, looking out at the fading orange light over the red rock, "in 7 months, you're the second person who hasn't immediately told me to go home." "Who was the first?" "An elderly Navajo man near Shiprock. He let me camp on his land for a week and told me the river's original name in Diné, which, for the record, translates roughly to the water that remembers where it came from." She took a sip of coffee. "I thought that was worth fighting for." Monroe was quiet again, that particular thoughtful quiet of his. Then he said, "The land here is the same. People think it's just empty, just dry and difficult, but it remembers." He looked across his own pasture where his cattle were moving slowly in the last light dark shapes against a darkening world. "I came here 8 years ago. I could have gone somewhere easier. I didn't want easier. I wanted something that was real." She looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time, not as a potential obstacle or a potential resource, but as a person. He had a scar along his right hand that was old and clean, the kind you get from work rather than from violence. His posture was easy but never careless, and there was something in the way he sat with the land, not against it and not on top of it, but genuinely with it, that she recognized as something she had been looking for and had not yet found in another human being. "Reckless," she said quietly. "What?" "That's what they call me, in New Mexico and Arizona both. I've been told more times than I can count that a woman doing what I'm doing, going where I'm going, fighting who I'm fighting, is reckless." She said it without bitterness, but also without dismissiveness. She had considered the word. She had held it up to the light and examined it. "I used to argue with it. Now I think the word they really mean is inconvenient." Monroe Malone made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not a performing laugh, not a social laugh, but the real kind that comes out when something lands so perfectly true that the body responds before the mind can catch up. "That's the most honest thing I've heard in a long time," he said. She smiled. It was a small smile, but it was a genuine one, and it changed her face in a way that was unexpectedly startling, like a window opening in a wall you thought was solid. She came back the next morning to collect her equipment and found that Monroe had left the gate unlatched. She told herself it was a practical consideration. He knew she would need to come back. There was nothing personal about an unlatched gate. She came back 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, each time with a specific technical purpose. She needed to cross-reference her spring measurements with the elevation data from the eastern ridge. She needed to verify the aquifer flow rate at different times of day. She needed to document the historical flood line markers carved into the sandstone on his property's eastern boundary, markers that proved the river had run through this exact area for centuries before any mining company arrived with a surveyor and a bag of cash. Each time Monroe was somewhere nearby, never intrusive, never obviously waiting, but there, asking questions that were smarter than they appeared on the surface. Listening in that complete way of his that made her feel, oddly and unusually, like what she was saying mattered, like the work mattered, not just as a legal strategy or a technical exercise, but as something worth defending in the deepest, most fundamental sense. On the 4th visit, she stayed for dinner. It was not planned. She had finished her documentation on the eastern ridge later than expected, and the road back to Santa Fe was 20 miles of bad road in the dark, and Monroe simply said, without particular ceremony, that there was enough stew on the stove for 2 people, and the spare room was available if she needed it. She told herself she was being practical. The spare room had a narrow iron bed and a window that faced east, and the sunrise over the red rock formations was so extravagantly beautiful that she lay there in the gray pre-dawn light for 30 minutes just watching it happen, which was the longest she had been still in approximately 7 months. Over dinner, she had discovered things about Monroe Malone that she had not been prepared for. He had been educated. Not at a university, but by the kind of deliberate, self-directed reading that was, in some ways, more rigorous than formal schooling. He had read widely in land law, in hydrology, in the history of the territorial surveys. He had a shelf of books above his writing desk that included a hydraulics engineering manual that was more current than anything the Beaumont Company had used in their fraudulent survey submissions. "Have you read Fanning's treatise on water supply engineering?" she asked, pointing at the spine. "Twice," he said. "You?" "3 times." She pulled it from the shelf without asking permission and opened it to a page she knew well. "This section on groundwater table calculation is the foundation of my entire argument against Beaumont's diversion claim. They cite the 1871 Mainzer tables for underground flow estimation, but those tables are based on coastal geological formations. They're completely inapplicable to high desert sandstone aquifer systems." Monroe leaned over her shoulder to look at the page. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, the particular warmth of someone who has spent the day outside. He smelled like wood smoke and dust, and something clean underneath it. "What tables should they have used?" he asked. "Powell's Colorado surveys from 1878. The geological profile is almost identical to this watershed. And if you apply Powell's figures to Beaumont's dam site, the diversion they built should have required a 3 times larger compensatory channel to maintain downstream flow rates. They built nothing. They knew they were drying up the farms, and they did it deliberately." She set the book down. "That's not a technical error, that's a choice." He straightened up and looked at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize and beginning to value, the one where he was fully engaged, fully present, turning something over in his mind with genuine care. "You could present that to the territorial engineer's office," he said. "I've tried. Twice. The territorial engineer reports to the governor's office. The governor has business relationships with 3 of Beaumont's primary investors." She closed the book gently. "The official channels are occupied. So you went around them." "I went through the land itself. I went directly to the evidence and built a case that is so technically airtight that even a compromised court would have difficulty ignoring it." She paused. "Or so I believed." He looked at her. "You don't believe it anymore." She was quiet for a moment. It was the first time she had let the doubt show, even slightly, to anyone. "I believe the work is right," she said finally. "I believe the evidence is irrefutable. I'm less certain that irrefutable evidence means anything in a system that is not trying to reach the right answer." Monroe leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind was coming down off the mesa, and the house settled into it the way old, well-made houses do, with a creak and a sigh that sounds like the building itself is breathing. "Then you force the system to make the choice publicly," he said. She looked at him. "You put the evidence where enough people can see it that a decision to ignore it becomes impossible to hide," he continued. "Courts can bury documents. They can't bury 100 witnesses." She stared at him. Her mind was already moving, already running the logistics forward. "The land grant families," she said slowly. "If I hold a public presentation of the survey data, not in a courthouse, somewhere open, somewhere the mining company cannot have controlled in advance. There's a meeting of the New Mexico Cattlemen's Association next month," he said, "in Las Vegas, 400 ranchers and land owners, people who understand water rights better than any judge ever will, because without water rights they're already dead." He paused. "And people who have reasons to dislike Beaumont that have nothing to do with your families." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're a member." "I am." "Could you get me a presentation slot?" "I could do more than that," he said quietly. "I know 3 ranchers on the Rio Mara who have been watching Beaumont move their survey stakes for 2 years. They've been waiting for someone to build a case worth joining." Something shifted in the room. The nature of the conversation changed, not from professional to personal, but from solitary to shared. From her problem to something they were looking at together. It was, she realized, the most frightening thing that had happened to her in 7 months of genuinely dangerous work. Not because she did not trust him, but because she did. She returned to her own camp in Santa Fe the next morning with her survey data, her notebook, and a very specific problem that had nothing to do with hydraulics or land law. She was beginning to care about what Monroe Malone thought of her, which was a thing she had carefully not done with anyone in a very long time. Her history with caring was not a happy one. She had been trained as a surveyor by her father, Elias Hart, who had been one of the best in New Mexico territory before the drinking, and the debt had taken him apart piece by piece. She had spent 3 years working alongside him, learning everything he knew, and then spent another 3 years quietly picking up the jobs he could no longer complete while pretending, for both their sakes, that he was still the one in charge. When he died in 1881, he left her his equipment, his client list, and a reputation built entirely on his name. She had rebuilt it on hers. It had taken 2 years and cost her several clients who did not believe a woman's survey data was legally reliable. One lawsuit from a competing surveyor who claimed she had stolen a commission that was his by right of gender, and a formal complaint filed with the Territorial Surveying Board by the Beaumont Mining Company 6 months into her investigation of their dam. That complaint had described her as reckless, irresponsible, and a danger to the integrity of territorial survey practice. She had framed the letter and hung it above her drafting table. But she had also, in quiet moments, felt the loneliness of it. Not the practical loneliness of working alone in the high desert, which she was entirely comfortable with. The other kind. The kind that comes from doing work that matters enormously to you in a world that largely wishes you would stop. She had not told Monroe any of this. She had told him the technical facts and the strategic situation, and he had responded with intelligence and practical support, and that was appropriate and correct. This was a professional relationship and a useful alliance, and she was going to keep it that way. She repeated this to herself approximately 11 times on the road back to Santa Fe. She almost believed it. The next 4 weeks were the most productive of the entire 7-month investigation. With Monroe's introduction, she gained access to 3 additional ranches along the Rio Mora, where she could document further evidence of Beaumont's fraudulent survey practices. She mapped a 12-mile stretch of the original river channel, documented 17 discrete sites of illegal earth moving, and compiled a survey record that, when laid out side by side, told a story so clear and damning that even someone without technical training could follow it. She and Monroe worked out the structure of her presentation together in letters, and twice in person, when she came through his gate in the evenings with mud on her boots and new data in her notebook. He would look at what she brought and ask the questions a skeptical audience member would ask, and she would refine her argument in response. It was the best kind of intellectual collaboration, the kind where both people are genuinely trying to get to the truth rather than to win, and it was making her presentation sharper and her case stronger and her awareness of him deeply inconvenient. He noticed things, small things that she had not expected him to notice. That she carried dried fruit in her left saddlebag and always ate a piece when she finished a calculation, which was an old habit from her father's kitchen that she had never examined and never mentioned. That she preferred silence while she was working, but the silence had to be inhabited. That a completely empty room made her measurements slightly less precise, which was an embarrassing and inexplicable truth she had never told anyone. One evening she arrived at his gate later than expected, having ridden hard across the mesa in failing light to make good time, and she found that he had put her coffee on 30 minutes earlier, time to be ready when she arrived, without them having agreed on a time. She stood in his kitchen with the cup in her hands and felt something move in her chest that she was not prepared for. "You timed this," she said. "You ride fast when the data's good," he said simply, not looking up from the fence map he was studying. The data must have been good today. She had to look away from him. The Cattlemen's Association meeting in Las Vegas, New Mexico, was held in October 1883 in the Grange Hall on the main street, a broad wooden building that smelled like cattle and lamp oil, and the particular masculine collective energy of several hundred people who worked hard land and knew it. Nora arrived the day before to set up her survey maps on the large presentation boards she had constructed for the occasion, 12 numbered panels that walked through the evidence in sequence, starting with the original 1873 river survey and ending with her own measurements at Monroe's Spring. She had not been nervous before a presentation in years. She was nervous now, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that part of the nervousness had nothing to do with the audience. Monroe arrived the morning of the meeting with two of the real Mora ranchers he had told her about, men named Castillo and Webb, who had been watching the slow theft of their watershed for 2 years and were visibly relieved to see, laid out in precise cartographic detail, the documentation that confirmed what their eyes had already told them. They shook her hand with the kind of directness that meant they were deciding in that moment to trust her, and she shook back with equal directness, which meant she was accepting the responsibility. The presentation was scheduled for the afternoon session. Before it began, Monroe found her behind the panel boards making a final check of her measurement annotations. "You're ready," he said. "I know I'm ready," she said. "I've been ready for 2 years." He almost smiled. "I know. That's not why I said it." She looked at him. He was standing with his hat in his hand, the way he stood when he was being particularly direct about something. There was something in his face that was different from the past month of careful, appropriate professional collaboration. Something that had been held very carefully at a certain distance and was now, she realized, somewhat closer. "Why did you say it?" she asked. He held her gaze for a moment that was 4 seconds long and felt considerably longer. "Because you've been carrying this alone for a long time," he said, "and you shouldn't have to." She did not answer immediately. The space between them had the particular quality of air before a storm breaks, charged and still and full of something imminent. "Monroe," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "After." She held that word for a moment. Then she nodded once, turned to her presentation boards and walked out in front of 400 ranchers and land owners and made the most important technical argument of her professional life. She was extraordinary. Monroe had known she was skilled. He had watched her work for a month and had read everything she gave him and had asked every hard question he could think of, and she had answered every one. But watching her in front of that room, in front of 400 skeptical, practical, experienced men who had heard plenty of promises and seen plenty of frauds, something beyond skill became visible. She began with the original survey. Simple. Clear. This is where the river was. These are the documented measurements. These are the water rights that were legally established on the basis of this survey. Rights held by families who had farmed this land for 2 and 3 generations. Then she showed Beaumont's survey. She showed the discrepancies, not in abstract technical language, but in terms every rancher in the room could understand. She showed them what 40 feet of measurement error meant in terms of water volume. She showed them what Beaumont's compensatory channel had actually provided versus what their survey claimed it would provide. She showed them the mathematical proof, derived directly from the Powell, Colorado surveys that any competent engineer should have used, that demonstrated the gap between what was claimed and what was delivered was not an error. It was a decision. She could have lost them there in the mathematics. She did not lose them. Because she had spent a month refining this argument with Monroe's questions echoing in her head, and she had learned to anchor every number in a truth that a man who understood land could hold. This family lost this field. This family's cattle died in this drought that would not have been a drought if the river still ran. This child was born in this dry season. The room was completely silent. Monroe, standing at the back, watched 400 men who had started the afternoon skeptical become 400 men who were furious. Then she showed them her final map, the one that tied everything together. The spring on Monroe's property, the aquifer connection, the hydrological proof that the river's original course was not just historically documented but physically, presently verifiable. The river had not been rerouted. It had been hidden. And it was still there, still moving underground, still carrying water that legally and morally belonged to the families downstream. In the silence that followed, a rancher in the third row named Gutierrez, a large man with 30 years and weathered skin, stood up and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "My cousin's farm is one of the 11. He lost everything." "I know," Nora said. "His name is in the record." Gutierrez looked at the man next to him, then at the man next to him. Then he sat down, but it was not a defeated sitting down. It was the kind where someone has just made a decision. By the time the meeting concluded, 47 ranchers had signed a formal petition demanding a federal review of Beaumont's territorial survey submissions. 7 of them had the legal standing to join as co-complainants in a federal case. 3 had direct evidence of their own that Nora had not known about, which she carefully documented that evening in the Grange Hall while Monroe stood at the door with the Rio Mora men, making sure no one who should not be inside was. She finished at midnight. She closed her notebook. She looked at the 12 presentation panels, still arranged in their sequence against the Grange Hall wall in the lamplight, and for the first time in 2 years she felt something that was not urgency or fury or the particular cold clarity of focused purpose. It was something warmer than all of those. Monroe was still at the door. She walked to him. He turned when he heard her boots on the floor. The hall was empty now, just the 2 of them and the lamplight and the maps. "You said after," she said. "I did," he said. She was a woman who was direct by nature and by necessity, and she did not see any reason to stop being direct now. "Not someone who makes things easy," she said. "I have been told this approximately 100 times by approximately 100 people. I work alone, I go where the work takes me, I fight anyone who needs fighting, and I will never, under any circumstances, stop being exactly who I am." "I know," he said. "You have a ranch, a good one, a real one, the kind of place that requires someone to stay. I know that too, so you understand the problem." He was quiet for a moment. The familiar, thoughtful quiet that she had come to understand was not evasion but genuine engagement. "I understand the problem you're describing," he said. "I'm not sure it's the same problem I see." She looked at him. "What problem do you see?" "A woman doing exactly what the land needs done," he said, "who has been told so many times that she's reckless for doing it that she started making their argument for them before anyone else gets the chance." He held her gaze steady. "The land doesn't need you to be easier, Nora. Neither do I." She stood in the lamplight and let that settle. Let it be real. Let herself feel what it felt like to have someone see the thing she actually was and want exactly that. Not a managed version or a redirected version or a version that kept herself smaller so the world would be more comfortable, but the actual, full, inconvenient, extraordinary thing. She took one step forward and she kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. She had not done anything tentatively in her adult life, and she was not starting now. It was thorough and honest, and it lasted long enough to be entirely clear about its intentions. And when she stepped back, Monroe's hat had somehow ended up on the floor, which neither of them had noticed happening. He looked at her in the lamplight with his dark eyes and the particular expression she would come to know as the one reserved exclusively for moments when something had affected him more profoundly than he was prepared to show. A brightness behind the calm, a crack in the stillness. "After," he said, very quietly. "Yes," she said. "After." They rode back to his ranch in the dark. The next 3 months were simultaneously the most difficult and the best of Nora's life, which was a combination she had not previously understood was possible. Difficult because the case was not over. It was in many ways only beginning. The 47 rancher signatures and the federal petition generated exactly the response she had predicted from the Beaumont Company, which was to escalate. Their lawyers filed preemptive motions in the territorial court. Their representatives visited 2 of the Rio Mora ranchers with offers that were thinly veiled threats. 3 of the co-complainants received notices of unrelated code violations on their properties, the timing of which was so obviously retaliatory that it was almost an insult to everyone's intelligence. And then there was the complaint filed by Beaumont's attorney with the Territorial Surveying Board, which alleged that Nora Hart had falsified survey data, that she had trespassed on private mining claims, and that she posed a threat to the legitimate operation of territorial commerce. The complaint named her reckless in 2 territories and called for the revocation of her surveying license in both New Mexico and Arizona. She read the complaint at Monroe's kitchen table on a cold November morning with her second cup of coffee and his hydraulics manual open beside her, and she felt the hot, clean, useful anger of someone who has been attacked not because they are wrong but because they are right. "They're frightened," Monroe said from across the table. "Good," she said. "Frightened people make mistakes." She was correct, and the mistake Beaumont made was a significant one. In their rush to file the complaint and discredit her data before the federal petition could be heard, they submitted their own survey documents to the Territorial Board, documents they claimed proved their original measurements were accurate. But in their haste, they submitted the original versions rather than the falsified copies that had been filed with the court. Nora caught it within 20 minutes of receiving the documents. She sat at Monroe's table with both sets of measurements in front of her, the official court filing and the newly submitted board documents, and she went through them with the meticulous, unhurried attention of someone who had spent 7 months learning the difference between what this land actually was and what Beaumont had claimed it was. The discrepancies were even larger than she had calculated. The original survey showed the dam site's impact radius at nearly double what the court filing claimed. The groundwater table measurements were different by 18 feet. The compensatory channel specifications were different from both previous versions, suggesting the company had been maintaining at least 3 separate sets of documents and had now, under pressure, mixed them up. She documented everything, cross-referenced everything, built the comparison into a supplementary report that was as precise and thorough as anything she had produced in the previous 7 months, and then she went into the front room where Monroe was repairing a saddle, and she set the report on the workbench beside him and said, "They made a mistake." He looked up. She told him what she had found. He listened with his hands still on the saddle leather and his eyes on hers, following every step of the logic, and when she finished his expression had that quality she had seen once before in the Grange Hall, the full weight of genuine respect that had nothing performing about it. "How soon can you get this to the federal office?" he asked. "I can ride to Santa Fe tomorrow," she said. "I'll come with you." She started to say she did not need an escort because she did not and because saying so was a reflex as deep as breathing. But she stopped. Not because she did not mean it, she genuinely did not need an escort, but because he was not offering to be an escort. He was offering to be beside her, which was a different thing entirely, and one she was, she found, willing to have. "All right," she said. They rode to Santa Fe together through the cold November high desert, with Consequence's breath making small clouds in the air and Monroe's bay gelding, a steady animal named Grant, keeping pace beside her. They rode mostly in companionable silence, which by now was its own kind of conversation. Occasionally he pointed out something in the landscape, a red-tailed hawk on a juniper, a section of old Spanish land-grant wall running along a ridge, and she pointed out corresponding features in the geological record that were visible in the rock formations, and it was the kind of conversation that makes a long road short. They arrived in Santa Fe in the late afternoon. She filed the supplementary report with the Federal Land Office. The clerk, a young man named Davies who had been quietly sympathetic to her case for months, looked at the documents with wide eyes and said, very carefully, "Miss Hart, these constitute evidence of deliberate fraud committed against a federal court." "Yes," she said, "they do. I'll need to bring in the supervising officer. I expected nothing less." The supervising officer was a federal land commissioner named Price, who had the look of a man who was very tired of complicated situations and was about to have his life made considerably more complicated. He read through her report for 45 minutes while she and Monroe waited in the anteroom on a wooden bench, their shoulders just touching. Commissioner Price emerged from his office with a face that had rearranged itself into something between grim and resolute. "Miss Hart," he said, "I am issuing an immediate hold on all Beaumont Mining Company survey filings in this territory pending a full federal audit. I am also requesting an emergency session of the territorial court to hear your evidence under federal oversight." He paused. "You should know that this will be contested, aggressively." "I'm aware," she said. "I've been waiting 2 years for contested." He almost smiled. "So I understand." He looked at Monroe Malone. "Your spring data is the cornerstone of this." "It's her data," Monroe said quietly. "From her survey, I just provided access." Price nodded. "Then I suggest you both stay in Santa Fe until the hearing. It may move quickly now." It moved quickly. The emergency session was scheduled for December, and Beaumont's legal team arrived from Denver with 4 attorneys and a considerable quantity of professional outrage. They requested delays, which were denied. They filed motions to exclude evidence, which were reviewed by a federal judge appointed specifically because the territorial court's conflict of interest had become, with the filing of Nora's supplementary report, impossible to officially ignore. It was during one of these pre-hearing motions that Beaumont's lead attorney made the mistake of referring to Nora, in open court, as a reckless amateur whose survey data represents not professional documentation, but the obsessive scribbling of a woman with a personal grievance. The federal judge, whose name was Harrington, and who had come up from Albuquerque with the particular no-nonsense bearing of someone with nothing to prove, looked over his glasses at the attorney for a long moment. "Counselor," he said, "are you prepared to contest the methodology of Miss Hart's survey work in technical terms?" The attorney was not. He had clearly not expected to need to be. "Then I suggest," Judge Harrington said, "that we proceed on the basis of the data rather than the descriptors." The hearing lasted 3 days. Nora presented her evidence in full, with every measurement, every cross-reference, every calculation laid out in the clear, sequential, irrefutable structure she had spent 7 months building. The Beaumont attorneys tried to attack it and could not find purchase, because there was nothing in it that was not fully documented and technically sound. Every time they suggested an alternative interpretation, she had already addressed it in the supplementary report. Every time they raised a question about methodology, she had the primary source data to back every choice she had made. On the second day, Beaumont's own former chief surveyor, a man named Aldrich who had apparently decided that the situation had shifted far enough that his personal legal exposure was now the more pressing concern, made a brief appearance as a federal witness and confirmed that the discrepancy between the court filing and the board filing was not an error. It had been deliberate. He had been instructed to produce whichever version was needed for whichever audience. It was over on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Judge Harrington found for the complainants on all counts. The Beaumont Dam was declared an illegal structure. The diversion was ordered reversed. The 11 land-grant families were to be restored their water rights, with compensatory damages to be calculated based on 7 years of loss. The fraudulent survey filings were referred to the territorial attorney for criminal investigation. And the complaint against Nora's surveying license was dismissed with a note in the record that described her methodology as meticulous and her findings as among the most comprehensively documented survey work submitted to a territorial court in the history of New Mexico. She was standing in the courthouse corridor when Monroe found her. She had not cried. She was not going to cry. She had spent 2 years building something and it had held, and the appropriate response to that was a kind of deep, steady satisfaction that was quieter than joy and more permanent. Monroe looked at her. He did not say anything at first. He just looked at her with those dark eyes that did not perform anything they did not mean, and she saw in them everything she needed to see. "You did it," he said finally. "We did some of it," she said. "No," he said with gentle precision. You did it, I helped carry it, that's different and you should know the difference. She held his gaze. Then she stepped forward and leaned against him, her head briefly against his shoulder, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the solid and reliable reality of him. It was a small thing, but it was, for Nora Hart, an enormous thing because she had not leaned on anyone in a very long time and she did not do it lightly. He put one hand briefly against her back. Light, steady. There. Then she straightened up because there was work still to be done. The reversal of the dam and the restoration of the 11 farms took the better part of the following spring. Nora was present for all of it, working with the Territorial Engineer's Office to oversee the dismantling of the illegal structure and the re-establishment of the original river channel. It was the most satisfying engineering work she had ever done, not because it was technically complex, though it was, but because she could watch the water move back into its old course inch by inch and acre by acre, could watch the dry beds fill and the downstream fields begin to green, could see in real and physical terms the consequence of everything she had fought for. Monroe came to see the dam dismantling on the day the main structure came down. He stood with her on the bank of what was once again the Culebra River and watched the water spread back into the channels it had been denied for 7 years. The water that remembers where it came from, she said quietly. He looked at her. That's what the old man near Shiprock called it, she said. Monroe nodded slowly. Around them, several of the land-grant families were standing in the shallows of the restored channel. The Gutierrez family, the Vigil family, the families from the petition. Children running in the water that their parents had lost and their grandparents had known. An elderly woman sitting at the edge of the bank with her bare feet in the current and her face turned up to the afternoon sun. Nora watched them and felt the particular weight of accomplished purpose, which is not lightness exactly, but the absence of a heaviness you have carried so long you had forgotten it was separate from you. I have to go back to work, she said. There's a case in Colorado. A land dispute near Pueblo, water rights again. A farmer named Briggs who's been fighting a railroad claim for 3 years. Monroe was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I'll be 3 months, maybe 4. I know that too. She turned to look at him. They had spent the winter and the early spring moving between her Santa Fe office and his ranch, having dinner, reading, arguing about hydrology and land law, and the relative merits of different survey instruments, and also in the quieter hours, talking about other things. His family in Missouri, his father's death and the land sale that had sent him west at 22 with enough money to stake a claim and a determination to build something lasting. Her father, the grief and the love of it tangled together in the way they always were, when someone who hurt you was also someone you had learned everything true from. The particular loneliness of expertise in a world that frequently punishes women for having it. The way the high desert looked in early morning light when the red rock came alive with color and the world felt temporarily clear. She had told him, one evening in February when the snow was coming off the mountains, and they were sitting by his fireplace with books open in their laps that neither of them was reading, that she had been afraid. Not of Beaumont or the courts or the legal risk, but of this. Of letting someone be important to her, of building something that could be taken, of the particular vulnerability of caring about the opinion of another specific human being. He had listened. He had said, I know what that is. She had said, tell me. He had said, I built this ranch alone for 8 years because building something alone is the only way to be sure it's yours. Everything that's mine I made. And then I watched a woman walk through my gate with mud on her boots and a theodolite on her mule and make the strongest possible argument that some things are worth building together just by existing. She had looked at him for a long time. That, she had said, is an extremely well-constructed sentence for a man who claims to be quiet. He had smiled. The full version of the smile, which she had seen only 3 times and was, she thought, one of the finest things she had ever observed. They had kissed again, much less urgently and much more thoroughly than the first time in the Grange Hall, and the February snow had come down outside the window, and the fire had burned, and it had been one of those evenings that settle into a person's foundation and stay. Now, on the bank of the restored Culebra River with the water moving back into its rightful place around them, she looked at him and said the thing she had been holding for several months. "I'm not looking for someone to ask me to stay," she said. "I know," he said. "But I am looking for someone who will still be there when I come back." He held her gaze with that steadiness of his that was not passivity or resignation but something chosen, something built and maintained with intention. "The gate's unlatched," he said. She understood what that meant. She understood it down to the foundation. 3 months, she said. "I'll have coffee ready," he said. She left for Colorado the next morning. She came back in 4 months. The Briggs case had been more complex than expected, the railroad's legal strategy more aggressive, requiring her to conduct an additional 2 months of field survey work in the Colorado high country before she had documentation sufficient to file a federal claim. She sent Monroe letters twice a month, letters that began professionally and became, over the course of the summer, the best writing she had ever done, because she was writing to someone who read with full attention and wrote back with equal seriousness, and because the distance clarified certain things that proximity had made complicated. She loved him. She had known it in some form since February, but Colorado made it certain. Not the easy, comfortable love of people who had not been tested, but the kind built from genuine knowledge of another person, knowledge of their mind and their character and their flaws, and the choice to want them anyway. She pulled up to his gate on a September evening, with the last of the summer light on the red rock and consequence breathing hard from the long final push, and her notebooks full of Colorado survey data and 4 months of accumulated certainty. The gate was unlatched. Monroe was on the porch. He stood when he saw her coming up the road, and she could see even at that distance that he had been watching for her, the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting without admitting he is waiting. She dismounted and tied consequence and walked to the porch, and he came down the 2 steps to meet her, and before she could say anything he said, quietly and without preamble, "I missed you considerably more than I had anticipated." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came up from somewhere genuine and unguarded, and she thought she would not trade that laugh for anything. "Good," she said. "So did I." She told him about the Briggs case over dinner, the Colorado survey work and the railroad's tactics and the technical arguments she had built, and he asked the right questions and the wrong ones and argued with 2 of her measurement interpretations on solid methodological grounds, and she revised her approach based on his argument, which she would not have done with anyone else and which meant something profound. After dinner she said, "Monroe." "Yes." "I have been thinking for approximately 4 months about whether there is a way to be who I am and also to be here." "What did you conclude?" "That it requires a particular kind of man who understands that being here doesn't always mean being physically present." He was very still, and I think I may have found him rather unexpectedly through a gate I unlatched myself. She met his eyes. "I'm asking if you want to build something with me, a real something. Understanding that it will look different from other things, because I am different from other people, and because you are too, and because the land here, the way you once described it, is real rather than easy." Monroe Malone looked at her across the table in the lamplight of his kitchen with its shelf of books and its view of the red rock and its smell of wood smoke and coffee, and he said, "I've been wanting that since you walked through my gate with your theodolite and your notebook and more good sense than anyone I've ever met." She said, "I was labeled reckless in 2 territories." He said, "You sound exactly like what the land needed." She held that. Let it be real. Let herself feel the full weight of being seen and accepted and wanted, not despite what she was but because of it. "Then yes," she said, "let's build something." They were married in March of 1884 in a small ceremony at the Las Vegas Grange Hall, the same building where she had changed the course of the Beaumont case the previous October. The real Mara ranchers were there. The Gutierrez family came. The elderly woman who had sat with her feet in the restored Culebra River was there with her granddaughter. Commissioner Price sent a letter that was official in its opening paragraph and surprisingly warm in its close. Judge Harrington, who was passing through on other business, stopped in and shook their hands with the look of a man who had presided over enough human difficulty to genuinely appreciate a happy occasion. Nora wore a dark green dress she had made herself with practical sleeves and a hem that would not be destroyed by mud or field work, which she considered a reasonable concession to ceremony. Monroe wore his good shirt and his least battered hat, and the clean expression of a man for whom this day was not a performance but a fact. When the words were said and the papers were signed, he leaned down and kissed her with characteristic thoroughness, and she kissed him back with characteristic completeness, and there was a sound from the assembled company that was less a polite murmur and more an unguarded, affectionate cheer, and she laughed again, that same surprised, genuine laugh, and thought she would not trade this either. The next 5 years were full. She continued to survey. She took cases in Colorado, in Arizona, in the Oklahoma Territory, and twice she was called to Washington to consult on proposed water rights legislation, where she sat across from federal engineers twice her age and 3 times her formal credentials, and declined, politely and firmly, to let anyone summarize her data on her behalf. She built a reputation that was no longer being called reckless by anyone, at least not in print, and the surveying board complaint against her license was eventually acknowledged, in a formal board resolution, as without merit. Monroe ran the ranch. He expanded it carefully, added a second cattle operation on leased land to the north, hired 2 permanent hands and paid them properly, and spent considerable portions of his abundant patience managing the fact that his wife was frequently in another territory. He wrote excellent letters. He kept the coffee ready. He read everything she sent him and argued with it intelligently and supported it without reservation. They had a son in 1885 who they named Elias, after her father. Nora had sat with that name for a long time before suggesting it. Her father had been a complicated man, and the love she had for him was correspondingly complicated. But she had learned everything that mattered about her work from him. The theodolite that had started the Beaumont case had been his, and she thought it was right to put his name into the future rather than leave it only in the difficult past. Monroe had agreed without hesitation, which was one more reason among 1,000 that she loved him. Elias was dark-eyed and stubborn from birth, which surprised no one who knew either of his parents. He sat up early and walked early, and was found at the age of 3, attempting to use his mother's survey compass, which had been left within reach by a father who thought this was funnier than his wife did. "He's going to be a problem," Monroe said, retrieving the compass before it ended up down a well. "He's going to be excellent," Nora said, from where she was at the drafting table making corrections to a survey report for the Oklahoma case. "Hand me that pencil." In 1887, they had a daughter, Clara, who was quieter than her brother and more observant, who from the earliest possible age watched everything with an attention that Monroe recognized as her mother's, and described, privately, as remarkable. She was sitting up at 4 months and conducting what could only be described as systematic experiments on the properties of her food at 8 months, and Nora watched this with the particular satisfaction of someone recognizing a familiar pattern. The ranch grew. The years moved. The work continued. In the spring of 1888, a group of 11 families gathered at the edge of the fully restored Culebra River. They had rebuilt. Not everything, not all at once, not without the permanent marks that loss leaves on people and land alike. But they were there. The fields were green again. The children of the families who had survived the drying-out years were old enough now to do the work of restoration alongside their parents. The elderly woman who had sat with her feet in the water was still there, older now, moving more slowly, but still there. Nora stood at the bank with Elias on her hip, 3 years old and intensely interested in the water flowing over the rocks below, and Monroe beside her with Clara asleep against his shoulder, in the particular way infants sleep, when they feel completely safe. And she thought about 7 months alone in the high desert with a theodolite, and a dark conviction that the right thing was worth doing even when no one was helping. She thought about the gate that had been unlatched. She thought about the water that remembered where it came from. She said to Monroe, "I've been asked to join the Federal Boundary Commission, the new land survey initiative for the remaining territories. It would mean 3 months," he said. She smiled. 5, probably. He shifted Clara gently against his shoulder and looked at Nora with those dark eyes that had never once looked at her with anything other than full and honest recognition. "The gate's unlatched," he said. Elias reached down toward the water with great determination. "That child is going to fall in," Monroe said. "He inherited my relationship with rivers," Nora said. "He'll be fine. He definitely inherited your relationship with risk." "Reckless," she said, looking sideways at him with a smile that was particular and private and meant exclusively for him. "I've been labeled reckless in 2 territories." "You sound exactly like what the land needed," he said. She laughed. The river moved below them, clear and cold and purposeful, running in its old course through the red rock and the dry high desert, remembering where it came from, carrying everything that the land had been storing for years of drought and silence and waiting. The sun was coming down in broad gold sheets across the mesa. The families along the bank were talking and laughing and letting their children into the shallows. It was not a quiet life. It was not an easy one. It was built from argument and measurement and long roads and difficult choices and letters written at midnight by lamplight and gates left unlatched in good faith. It had required 2 people who were willing to be fully, inconveniently, genuinely themselves, and to find in each other not a solution to that difficulty, but a companion for it. It was, in every sense that mattered, exactly what both of them had been looking for. Nora handed Elias to his father when the child's determination to enter the river reached a critical level of physical commitment, and she walked to the water's edge alone and crouched down and put her hand in the current. Cold and clean, and moving with that deep, unhurried certainty of water that has found its true course. She pulled her hand out and shook the drops from her fingers and stood up. Monroe was watching her, Elias on his hip now with the child's small arm wrapped around his neck, and Clara still asleep against his other shoulder. Both children held with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who did everything he did with full attention. He was watching her the way he always watched her, with that particular completeness, as if she was the most interesting thing in the landscape and always had been. She walked back to him. She put her wet hand against his jaw briefly, gently, and he leaned into it the small fraction of an inch that meant everything. And they stood together at the edge of the river their children would know, in the land that had waited for someone to fight for it, in the life they had built from truth and work and the decision to be brave enough to want something real. The Federal Commission letter was in her saddlebag. She would accept it in the morning. Tonight she was here. The water moved. The light moved. The family stood at the bank of the Culebra River with the red rock rising around them and the high desert sky going through all its extraordinary colors toward the dark, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the only kind of enough that lasts. Nora Hart, who had been labeled reckless in 2 territories and had fought for 2 years in the high desert alone, and had walked through a gate she unlatched herself, and had loved a quiet rancher who said she sounded like exactly what the land needed, stood in the last of the evening light with water on her hands and her family beside her and the future arranged in front of her like a survey map of excellent ground. She was not reckless. She was exactly right. And the land, the water, and the man beside her all knew it.